As highlighted by Justice Kirby, former High Court Justice of Australia, precedent has been referred to as the cornerstone of the common law judicial system. The doctrine of precedent, also referred to by its Latin name stare decisis, is the concept that a previous decision of a court is binding and thus should be followed in other cases with similar facts and circumstances by other courts. Precedent ultimately develops case law, which is the body of law made and developed by the judiciary, which can be contrasted with statute law, which is that developed by the legislature. As a general rule, all courts are bound by the decisions of courts higher in the same hierarchy, which is known as binding precedent. When considering the court hierarchy from an Australian perspective, there are essentially 9 parallel hierarchies. You've got a federal hierarchy, 6 state hierarchies, and 2 territory hierarchies. The commonality between these 9 hierarchies is the High Court of Australia, which sits at the apex of each. So when considering how precedent operates in practice in the state system, using New South Wales as an example, decisions being heard in a lower court, such as the local court, must follow the decisions in all the courts above it, such as the District Court, the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal, and the High Court. It is also important to note that where a court has a full court or multiple judges, this will be more influential and binding than the decision of a single judge. It should be noted at the outset that lower courts, so the local courts and magistrates' courts in the different jurisdictions, cannot establish binding precedent. Some other general rules that surround binding precedent include that courts do not need to follow their own earlier decisions, but from a practical perspective, they do typically tend to follow their own decisions. 2. Only the core reason for the decision of a case, that is, the ratio decidendi of the case, is binding on lower courts. That means that other statements in the case, namely the obiter dicta, is not binding, although it is certainly persuasive, especially in much higher courts. Without delving too deeply into the concepts of ratio and obiter in this video, it should be noted that the ratio of a case can be difficult to identify and in some instances can be borderline impossible to identify, such as where there are multiple judges all coming to different conclusions. This can therefore make applying a decision to a subsequent decision difficult. Obiter, on the other hand, forms those statements and expositions in a case that do not form part of the ratio, such as hypothetical discussions, considerations of concepts that aren't in dispute, and different lines of reasoning. Remember that this is only persuasive, not binding, when considering the precedential value of a case. The third thing to consider is that as the highest court in any of Australia's 9 court hierarchies, the High Court of Australia is not bound by its own past decisions, as outlined in Attorney General for New South Wales and Perpetual Trustees Company Limited. Where a decision is not binding, that is, the decision was not heard in a case above it within the court hierarchy, the decision may nonetheless be what is known as persuasive precedent. Persuasive precedent are those decisions that a judge may follow, but is not bound to do so. As an example, if a decision is being heard in the New South Wales Supreme Court, a decision that has been heard in the Queensland Supreme Court would not necessarily be binding, but it could certainly be persuasive if the facts and law are similar. Similarly, a decision heard in a similar court system, so say the United Kingdom, may also prove persuasive without necessarily binding our courts here in Australia. Now, where there are decisions that are precedential in nature, judges are able to avoid following it where they can identify sufficient differences between the case based on its factual matrix. This is referred to as distinguishing the case from the precedent before it, and ultimately is what allows our case law to continue developing and changing. Precedent forms an incredibly important part of Australia's justice system. It creates consistency in the approach by judges within our courts, creates certainty and equality for citizens who are subjected to the legal system, thus upholding the rule of law, and also creates efficiency within the justice system, where the courts are able to apply the same rules to similar factual scenarios.